Well, in the beginning, we had a partnership between West Fraser and the Alberta government, and we wanted to do things working together in the areas of forest management. And along came a federal funding program called the Green Fund, and there was a competition. So we got together, the two primary sides, government and the company, and thought about what we could do to apply for one of these model forests. And so we wrote a proposal and talked about how we would set up a partnerships to do research and generate information that both sides would be able to use to improve forest management. So I was involved with the group that brainstormed the idea, and I helped to write the proposal. And then the proposal was successful, and we found ourselves with funding that we didn't have before and had to set up a partnership and get started. Right from the beginning, we decided it had to be a partnership, and it had to be driven by managers who had real questions for needs that they had problems to face during their everyday jobs. So we set it up so that the managers would ask questions, and then we connect the management questions to researchers who would turn that into science and get that knowledge and connect very closely back to the managers, who would then take the knowledge that had been garnered and put it into practice. And that partnership model, based on a research management collaboration, was what we started off with, and it served us very well and has continued right to the future. If a person had thought about it, you might have been able to imagine it, but we were pretty focused on day-to-day and what we needed to get done and what we were trying to learn about so that we can improve management. But the thought of the model of a partnership-driven, value-based enterprise where you were getting knowledge that really was needed and was going to be put to good use, it was logical that it would grow and get more partners and more interest, because it's really added values, and it's a unique partnership that's different than traditional research organizations and how research gets done. Well, we're positioned really well in that we now have a very wide breadth of interest and knowledge to draw upon, 20 years of gaining new knowledge. And we're getting to the point now where we can start integrating between programs and start looking at bigger picture issues and questions like cumulative effects and overall land use, and even getting into areas like climate change that we wouldn't have been able to do back in the early days because we simply didn't have the capacity or the knowledge. But now we've built up information from all of our different programs and research knowledge over the years that we can start putting things together, looking at these really big picture items. Healthy landscapes is a good example of an enterprise there where we can contribute from a variety of our other programs, water, grizzly bear, natural disturbance, and put all of that knowledge together into something that can really help our partners in their needs. And the Alberta Land Use Framework is a good example of that. Well, an early focus was on species that might be at risk, and there was very little known about pileated woodpeckers in Canada. Most of the research had come from the U.S. Pacific Northwest, and that suggested that those birds needed old growth forest and really large snags for nesting. And we didn't have the same kinds of forests up here, so it was thought that it would be a good idea to start research on that species up here and find out what their local habitat ecology would be, so that forest managers here could incorporate the needs of that species into their programs. Actually, I did the research as part of my PhD, and the first summer we spent many days looking for pileated woodpecker nests with a search image for large conifer snags, which came from the U.S. research. We only found 2 nests. It didn't look very promising, but then we stumbled across these 2 nests, and it turned out that they were both in living aspen trees that had been infected by fungus that had heart rot inside. And after we changed our search image and knew what to look for, we started finding nests all over the place. And over the course of the next 3 years, we found 140 nests. And that was one of the learnings, was that they didn't nest in big conifer snags in Canada. They nested in living deciduous trees, and aspen with this heart rot fungus was their favorite nesting tree. We also learned that their territory sizes up here were almost an order of magnitude higher than they were in the U.S. So in the U.S. they might have averaged about 250 hectares. Up here it's 25 square kilometers, or 2,500 hectares. And that's because up here they have to make it through the winter, and they need food resources, which is primarily carpenter ants for this species, to get them through the winter. And that needed an area 10 times bigger than they needed down in the U.S., where they also had food resources like termites. So taking all of that information, what we learned was they're quite flexible in their habitat requirements. There were lots of nesting trees and stands that would produce those kinds of trees on the landscape, and there were also lots of habitats that produced trees that carpenter ants, their favorite food, would use. So one thing that we did learn was that we probably didn't need to adjust current forest management practices too much to protect pileated woodpeckers in Canada. So that was good news. But we were able to tweak things. So we learned, for example, that they didn't like to forage out into clear cuts unless there was some standing trees or snags out in the clear cuts. And that wasn't necessarily for food. It was because they needed that for escaping their predators. And the other thing we learned was the main predator of the pileated woodpecker, and this is a pretty big bird, crow-sized, was a hawk called the northern goshawk. And this northern goshawk was the one that got the pileated woodpeckers that were radio tagged most often. And the way they'd get away from a northern goshawk is they would fly over to the closest tree, land on the tree, and dodge around the trunk so the goshawk couldn't catch it. Hawk couldn't fly around the tree faster than they could dodge around the tree. So they wouldn't fly too far away from trees when they were foraging. So we learned that if there were trees here and there scattered out in the middle of clear cuts, the pileatids would go out in there and forage on stumps and logs and things, as long as they had a tree nearby that they could get away from the goshawks. That project was pretty well wound up. I'm still monitoring and finding nest trees, just as personal interest over the years, but now that led to research on other woodpeckers. There was another master's student in looking at the other woodpecker species. And then more recently there's been concern about some of the woodpeckers like northern three-toed woodpeckers and black-back woodpeckers, which come in after there's been a forest fire and feed on the abundant bark beetles and other insects that come in to feed on the dead trees. So in forest management, we're not getting as many fires anymore because we're replacing fires with harvesting. So the concern is well, perhaps there might not be enough habitat for those fire follower species if fire is less frequent on the landscape. So there's always new questions that come up, and there's been other research done on those other woodpecker species that will help to answer those questions. Okay, West Fraser is formerly Weldwood of Canada Limited, and West Fraser bought Weldwood in 2005. And the company has been a founding partner and sponsor of the Foothills Research Institute right from the beginning. The original Foothills Model Forest was based on our forest management area, which is around 1 million hectares surrounding Hinton. And so we had a vested interest in getting better knowledge to improve our management of that forest management area, which is public land that we're entrusted to manage by agreement with the province of Alberta. Well, we are living and working on public land, and there's a stewardship responsibility to the province and the citizens of Alberta. So we recognize that to maintain a business and be sustainable over the long term, we have to look after the land that we're entrusted to manage. And that means looking beyond the trees and looking at some of the other values like water and wildlife and soil and air. And so we felt that we needed to partner with government and others that were interested in and working on the land as well to get the knowledge that we needed to improve management. And it was pretty clear that we could do things like this by ourselves, but we then would run the risk of it not being accepted if we didn't get others involved. And also it was more expensive to do it by ourselves. by partnering, we made sure that everybody was interested in the same questions, helped to pay for the research, and all shared in the benefits of the research and being able to improve management. Well, one that was really interesting was back in the 90s we were doing a forest management plan, and this was before there was any provincial government policy related to the question of old growth or old forest. And so our forestry manager at the time asked me, how much old forest should we have? And I said, well, 12%. And he said, well, where did you get that number from? I said, well, I got it from the Brundtland Commission that came out in 1987. And he said, oh, well, where did they get it from? And I said, well, as far as I know, they picked a number out of thin air. And he said, well, is there some way we could come up with a scientifically based number that would be defensible in a forest management plan? And I said, well, there's this new concept came out of the U.S. that talks about the range of natural variation in forests. And forests are subject to changes because of fires and other things. And over time, you might have an amount of old forest that ranges between two bounds. And I said, if we could learn what that would be for our forest and then manage in our forest management plan to be within that range, then we would have a scientifically defensible basis. And that was actually the genesis of the FRI Natural Disturbance Program, that very question. And it was a conversation between two managers, and Hugh Lougheed, the forestry manager, went and talked to this young hotshot from BC named Dave Anderson, who just finished his PhD on that very subject, and said, how would you like to come and do some research in the foothills of Alberta along the same lines? And Dave jumped at it, and that started the FRI-ND program, which is now the Healthy Landscapes program, and has been going for, I think, 13 or 14 years, and gone far beyond that original question. By the way, the answer that came out of the research wasn't 12%, it was 6 to 23%. And that was built into West Fraser's forest management plan back in 1999. At the time, it was the first Alberta forest company that had tackled that issue. And since then, all of the forest management plans in Alberta and the Alberta Government Planning Standard have all adopted that approach. So one little conversation led to research, which led to a revolution in forest management, so that now all forest management plans in Alberta have incorporated old forest targets. So it's been a pretty good evolution of a simple question. One of them is called Neptune, and again it goes back to a question I had. Dave Anderson had done all this research on forest fires, and he'd mapped out what we called the architecture of a fire. What does a fire look like? What's the pattern look like? So he found that there were patches that were burned, and there were patches that the fire had missed, and other patches the fire had burned partially, and there were shapes attached with the burned patches and the unburned patches. And he called those fire events. And he measured them on a whole pile of natural wildfires. And then we said as managers, well, we'd like to make harvest blocks look like those. So to be able to compare harvest blocks with all the data he had, he came up with a model called Neptune, which is sponsored by a bunch of partners. And it maps what fires do, and it maps a harvest plan that a planner might make. And then it compares the metrics, the shapes, the sizes, the numbers of patches from your harvest event with that range from fires to see if you're within the range. So it provides a really convenient accounting and bookkeeping system so that a manager can check back in each of their new harvest designs to see if they're within what you might expect to see if a fire had burned here. And over time, we'll be able to produce a forest that looks very much like the natural forest that was produced after forest fires. And we've all adopted the idea that that's a good premise because the native species and other biodiversity that have adapted to that natural disturbance regime, in our case it's mainly fires, would like to see the same kinds of patterns and shapes produced after harvesting that would have been produced after fires. So that's another example of a tool that we're actively using. We're starting to compare our harvest plans with those fire shapes. And we're building a new forest management plan, which will look at the pattern in the entire forest management area compared to what you might expect after fires, to see if we're on track. The biggest issue, I think, for us in Alberta here is we're not the only industrial tenant on the forest. And if we were, then we could relatively just work with the government and recreation groups, and environmental groups, and Aboriginal groups. But we have another big elephant in the room here in Alberta, and it's called the oil and gas industry. And they have a lot of impact on the land, particularly in the areas of roads and pipelines and well sites. And so we're all playing on the surface of the land. Well, playing is probably too cavalier a word, but we're all working on the surface of the land, and we need to find ways of working together. And that's the biggest challenge I see ahead of us. So the issue of cumulative effects of all activity and how we can manage cooperatively to manage those effects so that we can sustain the development that's been authorized by the Alberta government and still protect all of the non-industrial values like species at risk and water and soil and things like that. And there's some pretty exciting things that FRI has gotten into, and one of them is the work that FRI has started with associations. So before we were just doing research, but now we've got associations such as the Foothills Landscape Management Forum and the Foothills Stream Crossing Partnership, that are groups of companies and government and other interested parties that are trying to take some of this knowledge and actually develop planning systems that will put the knowledge to use on the ground. And FRI is there to support these associations with knowledge and helping to plan demonstrations and evaluate whether those demonstrations are effective. So I think that's a pretty exciting new area beyond research, because it takes research to the ground and starts to evaluate it, and we're able to learn by doing and get better as we go forward.